Hello friends, welcome. Today in this class we will talk about the various measures of the government deficit. In this lecture first we talk about the meaning and the concept of the government deficit. Then we talk about the measures that are the revenue deficit, fiscal deficit and the primary deficit. So now let's talk about each in detail. So let's first start with the government deficit or the budgetary deficit. Okay, budgetary deficit. What does deficit mean over here? Here deficit means the expenditure that is more than the revenue. Okay, so when the expenditure of the government is higher than the expenditure of is higher than the total revenue of the government, then we have the deficit. And when the budgetary expenditure of government is more than the budgetary revenue, then we have the budgetary deficit. Okay, so we can write it mathematically over here that budgetary expenditure less budgetary revenue, or we can say that total expenditure minus total revenue, that will give the budgetary deficit. Okay, so got the concept over here, the budgetary deficit. Now the budgetary deficit are of three types. Okay, budgetary deficits are of three types. The first one is the revenue deficit. Okay, one is the revenue deficit. The second one is the fiscal deficit. And the third one is the primary deficit. It is the basic type of the deficit. Okay, we will understand these all three in detail one by one. So let's first start with what is the revenue deficit. We have the revenue budget in the government, that is one of the type of the budget. Revenue budget include the revenue receipts, okay, and revenue expenditure, that is included in the revenue budget. Now revenue deficit. So when the revenue expenditure is higher than the revenue receipt, then we have the revenue deficit. That is, revenue expenditure is more than the revenue receipt. Okay. Here the revenue deficit includes the transactions related to the current income and current expenditure. Okay, it includes the transactions related to the current income and current expenditure only. Okay, so here revenue deficit shows that the government's earning of the government is insufficient to meet the functioning of its department even. Okay, the revenue what the government is getting is not even able to fulfill the functioning of its department. Okay, and therefore the government have to borrow money not only to finance its investment but also to fulfill the consumption activity of the government. Okay, that means that when there is a revenue deficit, that is the expenditure is higher than the income, then the government having the dis-saving, okay, government having the dis-saving, and therefore the government have to use its saving of the other sectors of the economy to finance its consumption activity. Okay, and therefore it forces government either to decrease cost or to increase the revenue. Now government increases revenue through increasing the direct and indirect taxes, okay, to the rich people. Okay, so increasing the direct and indirect taxes for the rich people, government can increase its revenue. Okay, and the other way of it reducing the revenue deficit is cutting down the cost. Now, some of the costs are the committed cost, and therefore the government cannot cut the committed cost. The government have to pay that cost. Okay. So, the government cut the productivity expenditure cost, okay, or the welfare cost. Okay. And when the government cut down the welfare cost, it reduces, it slows down the growth process of the economy. Okay. And the welfare having the adverse effect on the economy. There is a very less welfare in the economy due to the cutting down of the welfare cost by the government. Okay. So this is about the revenue deficit, that is when the revenue expenditure is more than the revenue receipt. Okay. Now let's talk about the fiscal deficit. Okay. When we have the fiscal deficit, so when the total expenditure is higher than the total receipt, then we have the fiscal deficit. Here total receipt is exclusive of borrowings, exclusive of the government borrowing. Okay. So when the total expenditure is more than the total receipt, exclusive of the borrowing, then we have the fiscal deficit. So how to find out the fiscal deficit? We have total expenditure includes the revenue expenditure and the capital expenditure. Okay. Total expenditure, revenue expenditure and the capital expenditure, right? And total receipt, that is exclusive of the borrowing, that includes the revenue receipt, okay, and the recovery of loan, okay, and the other capital receipt. Okay. So when we do the summation of this, we get the total receipt. Okay. So when we deduct the amount of total receipt from the total expenditure, we get the fiscal deficit. Okay. Over here we have the fiscal deficit. Here in fiscal deficit, we are not deducting the borrowing of the government from the total expenditure. Okay. So fiscal deficit is nothing but the borrowings of the government. Okay. Here the borrowings is the accumulated debt. Accumulated debt includes the loan amount plus the interest on the loan. Okay. So fiscal deficit is nothing but the borrowings of the government, and thus fiscal deficit shows the requirement of borrowing for the government. How much amount of money the government need to borrow, that is shown by the fiscal deficit. Okay. So if the fiscal deficit is higher, government requires to borrow more amount of money, and if the fiscal deficit is lower, then the government required to borrow less amount of money. Okay. Here the borrowings also include the interest plus the loan amount. Okay. So here the fiscal deficit means the spendings are increasing faster than the earning. Okay, it shows the increasing spendings faster than the earning. Okay. Here there is a question that is the fiscal deficit, can the fiscal deficit without revenue deficit? Okay. Yes, fiscal deficit can be without the revenue deficit. When the revenue budget is balanced, that is the revenue expenditure is equal to the revenue receipt, then the government have to borrow only the amount of the borrowing money. Okay. So the fiscal deficit can be without the revenue deficit. Okay. Now let's move on to the primary deficit. Okay. What is the primary deficit? We have talked about the revenue deficit, fiscal deficit. Now let's talk about the primary deficit. Primary deficit is fiscal deficit minus interest payment. Here interest payment is a net interest payment, that is the total interest the government have to pay minus the interest which the government receive. Okay, that is the net interest payment. And fiscal deficit is the amount of the borrowing. We have said that fiscal deficit is the borrowings, and borrowings over here is the inclusive of the interest amount. Okay, so when we deduct interest from the borrowing, we get the amount of the primary deficit. Okay, when we deduct the amount of the interest from the borrowing, that is known as the primary deficit. Here the primary deficit shows that how much of the government borrowing, that is what the government borrow, okay, that how much of the government borrowing is going to meet the expenses apart from the interest. Okay, it shows the expenses government meet, that is apart from interest payment, that is known as the primary deficit. Okay, in the fiscal deficit shows the total amount that the government need to borrow, whereas primary deficit shows the amount, only the amount that is exclusive of the interest payment. Okay, so this is about the three measures of the government deficit, that is the revenue deficit, fiscal deficit and the primary deficit. I hope you understand the concept well. Stay tuned for the further lecture. Thank you so much.